The most skillful survivor in history. That's exactly how I would describe Cecily Neville. This woman lived through the Wars of the Roses, outlived the reigns of 5 kings and even gave birth to 2 of them, and buried almost her entire dynasty. And yet, in a twist of fate, her blood still runs in the veins of the British royal family to this very day. The story of a woman who came closer than anyone to becoming Queen of England, but in the end, never was, in today's video. What comes to your mind when you hear the name Cecily Neville? Most likely, the first thing you think of is her nickname, Proud Cis. And honestly, for a woman of such origin, from such a powerful family, it's hard to imagine she could have been called anything else. To begin with, on her mother's side, she was a descendant of Edward III, which means royal blood, quite literally, ran through her veins. Her mother, Joan Beaufort, was the half-sister of Henry IV, the aunt of Henry V, and the great-aunt of Henry VI. Cecily was the youngest of 22 children. She was born on May 3rd, 1415, at Raby Castle, which later earned her another famous nickname, the Rose of Raby. And if you're already shocked at the idea that her poor mother had so many children, don't worry. Her father, Ralph Neville, was married twice, and it was in his second marriage to Joan that 14 of those children were born. The rest came from his first marriage. But I didn't mention this enormous number of brothers and sisters by accident, because those who lived to adulthood went on to marry into some of the most powerful families in England, effectively creating an entire network of alliances. This was no longer just a family, it was a dynasty, a clan. And all of these blood ties would go on to play a crucial role in the Wars of the Roses. Let's take a look at the family portrait of this enormous household. And there she is, Cecily Neville, right at the centre, placed exactly where she belongs, dressed in the finest garments and adorned with the most exquisite jewels. And that is no coincidence. Out of all her sisters, it was Cecily who was destined for the most advantageous match. At just 9 years old, she was betrothed to her father's ward, Richard Plantagenet. Richard carried royal blood from Edward III on both his mother's and his father's side, which in practice meant that he arguably had an even stronger claim to the throne than Henry VI himself. And in terms of wealth, he was second only to the king. And from everything we know, this marriage turned out to be a remarkably harmonious union. I'm not sure it's fair to speak of love, but we do know that Cecily accompanied her husband on many of his foreign missions, and they tried to reunite whenever it was possible, despite the endless campaigns Richard was leading. In this marriage, they had 12 children. Among them were Edward, George, and Richard, 3 boys whose destinies would go on to shape the history of England. Richard Plantagenet remained faithful to his wife. He didn't even father a few illegitimate children, which for that time was actually quite unusual. But what's interesting is that it was Cecily whose fidelity in this marriage was called into question. Do you remember how, in The White Queen, Jaquetta Woodville says she had heard rumours about Cecily's infidelity? But could a woman so proud really have allowed herself to be unfaithful? The whole issue comes down to timing. When Edward was conceived, Richard was away, and simple arithmetic seemed to cast doubt on everything. But most likely, the couple simply met somewhere along the way, which was quite common at the time, or Edward was born prematurely. What truly matters is that Richard himself never doubted his paternity. So, Cecily's reputation as an unfaithful wife was most likely unfounded, even if her own sons later chose to use those rumours to their advantage. But not everyone was pleased to watch this strong marriage, and the rising power of the House of York. Margaret of Anjou, the wife of Henry VI, whose own claim to the throne was, in fact, weaker than that of Cecily's husband, had struggled for years to produce a long-awaited heir, all while her husband's mental state continued to deteriorate. And if it hadn't been for the king's madness, Cecily Neville might have lived out her life as a wealthy noblewoman and simply faded into the pages of history, just like the rest of her family. But as the king's behaviour grew more and more unstable, the star of Richard Plantagenet began to rise brighter and brighter. He was appointed protector of the realm, effectively becoming the most powerful man in England. And to understand what happened next, just think of Game of Thrones, the storyline of Eddard Stark and Cersei, because it was this very real episode of history that inspired it. Margaret of Anjou soon gave birth to a son, but many doubted that Henry VI was truly the father, given his mental condition. Margaret did everything she could to push Richard out of power, just like Cersei in the series, and his removal from the royal council became the spark that ignited the Wars of the Roses. The Wars of the Roses were a series of battles that felt almost like a game of ping-pong, with victory constantly shifting from one side to the other. Of course, Richard received enormous support, including from his wife's powerful family, those who came to be known as the Yorkists. And Cecily found herself right at the centre of this conflict, where the entire future of her family was at stake, and fortune could change at any moment. For example, in the moments of her husband's defeat, when he fled abroad with his allies to gather new forces, it was Cecily Neville who became his eyes and ears. Their family was stripped of all lands and wealth, and this proud woman was even forced to kneel in London before Henry VI, begging for mercy and for support for herself and her children. But when her husband managed to gather strength once again, returned to England with his army, and captured London in 1460, Cecily, in a sense, became a queen-in-waiting. She proudly carried one of the royal insignia through the streets of the capital during the procession. She was, quite literally, just one step away from the throne, but fate had other plans for her. That same year, her husband, Richard Plantagenet, would have his head placed on a spike, much like Eddard Stark. And if we continue the parallel, the reason for that defeat was betrayal by his allies. Alongside him, another of Cecily's sons, Edmund Plantagenet, was also executed. In a single day, she lost everything: her chance at the crown, her husband, and her son. But Cecily Neville would not have been herself if she had simply given up. Someone else, in her place, might have surrendered, but not her. She knew she still had sons of royal blood, and she did everything in her power to place her eldest son, Edward IV, who was only 18 at the time, on the throne. She petitioned the city authorities to keep the gates of London closed to the Queen, and instead to wait for her son's arrival and swear their loyalty to him. And the fact that they did so speaks volumes about her courage and her power of persuasion. Within days of arriving in London, Edward was proclaimed king, while Margaret of Anjou and her army were forced to retreat north through the snow. When Edward set out for one of his most decisive battles, the Battle of Towton, he showed remarkable trust, leaving the governance of the kingdom entirely in his mother's hands. He appointed her head of his household, effectively making her his regent. After his victory, he ascended the throne as Edward IV, the first king of the Yorkist dynasty. And Cecily, now the king's mother, became the most powerful woman in England. Her influence over her 18-year-old son was immense. She enjoyed his complete and unquestioning respect. She even incorporated the Crown of England into her own coat of arms, making it clear what position she held. It was she who resided in the royal apartments intended for the Queen of England. And this did not change even after the young king secretly married Elizabeth Woodville. And of course, it's important to talk about Cecily's relationship with her daughter-in-law. For example, in the series The White Queen, Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville is portrayed as a great personal tragedy for Cecily, where she openly rejects her son's choice. And in reality, Elizabeth was indeed not the most suitable match for Edward, especially considering that he had just taken the throne and was in need of strong political alliances with other royal houses. But Cecily never publicly showed her dissatisfaction, nor did she enter into open conflict with Elizabeth. On the contrary, she even assigned one of her finest ladies-in-waiting to serve her. And there are no records from ambassadors or contemporaries describing any real rivalry between these two women at court. Although, most likely, she was not pleased with her son's decision, and still considered herself, by birth, above her daughter-in-law. Just take a look, for example, at an image created during Edward's reign. After his marriage, Cecily is depicted kneeling behind Edward's wife and queen, Elizabeth. Yes, formally, she stands second, as if yielding her place. But notice one crucial detail. It is Cecily who is dressed in the royal arms of England. And to me, it feels as though, across the centuries, Cecily is sending us a very clear message. Never, not for a single moment, think that I am not the most important woman in the room. And it might seem that now Cecily Neville could finally spend the rest of her life in honour and respect as the king's mother. But a new blow came from her own second son, a blow that would force her to choose between her children, something no mother should ever have to face. And this inner conflict between her sons would mark the beginning of the end for the young Yorkist dynasty. George, ambitious and unwilling to remain in his brother's shadow, joined forces with his father-in-law Richard Neville to raise a rebellion against Edward IV. He used the argument that his brother was illegitimate and sought to claim the crown for himself. Cecily tried to intervene. She personally went to meet George and even offered her own home as neutral ground for the brothers to reconcile. And although, for example, the series The White Queen portrays Cecily as always favouring and loving George more, in reality that wasn't the case. She remained loyal to her eldest son, the king, even as she did everything she could to prevent her children from destroying one another. The first time, whatever she said worked. George returned to the family, and that helped Edward regain his throne. But 7 years later, she was not able to achieve the same outcome. Edward had George arrested on charges of treason, and in February 1478, he was executed, despite Cecily's pleas for mercy. Her son was drowned in a butt of wine. I think it's devastating for any mother to lose a child. But it is especially horrifying to watch your own children destroy each other. After that, Cecily largely withdrew from court. And whether it was grief over George's death, anger toward Edward, or simply exhaustion, it was only natural. But Edward did not long outlive his executed brother, only by about 5 years. When he suddenly died, Cecily Neville was around 60, and now she had only one surviving son left, Richard. But she still had many grandchildren. One of them was meant to become king. Edward's son, a 12-year-old boy, was to ascend the throne, while Richard was expected to guide and support his nephew as Lord Protector. But very soon, her grandsons turned into prisoners of her own son, who declared them illegitimate and took the crown for himself. I suspect that Cecily did not actively support Richard's rise to the throne, but she did not oppose it either. She understood that a young boy king in England at that time would hardly have been able to hold onto the throne for long, while her son was far more experienced in both politics and war, which gave her dynasty a better chance of survival. And yet, Cecily did not attend Richard's coronation, which could also be seen as a statement in itself. But in the series, it's portrayed as if Cecily Neville herself was the main conspirator against Elizabeth Woodville and Edward's children, and even helped her son take the throne. And, although this was not the fate she had ever wished for her sons, Cecily Neville had now become the mother of a second King of England. But her last heir was not destined to rule for long. Richard III was overthrown in 1485 during the invasion of Henry VII. His death brought an end to Yorkist rule over the crown, leaving Cecily without sons and without power. Everything she had helped build collapsed. For a woman as ambitious as Cecily Neville, this was likely a devastating blow, but she had survived too many battles to fight another one. Instead, she accepted the new king and the new order, and turned her attention to the only legacy she had left. Her granddaughter, Elizabeth of York, becoming, in a sense, the grandmother of a queen. And it was through Elizabeth that Cecily's blood would continue to flow in every future English monarch. It was not the victory she had once imagined, but it was survival. And for Cecily, as we've seen, survival was the red thread running through her entire life. She lived for another 10 years and even outlived her daughter-in-law Elizabeth Woodville. In her final years, Cecily withdrew from public life. She devoted herself to religion, gave generously to religious institutions, and gained a reputation as a deeply devout woman. In the series The White Queen, she is once again portrayed as a scheming figure, taking part in conspiracies against Henry VII through her daughter, Margaret. But in reality, her later life was far less dramatic. She chose to stay away from politics, living quietly at Berkhamsted Castle, managing her estates. She died on May 31st, 1495, at the age of 80, having outlived her entire family, the Wars of the Roses, and one of the most turbulent centuries in English history. Cecily Neville never wore a crown, but she had an immense influence on the monarchy and on history itself, even if her name is often overshadowed by the more dramatic stories of her family members. She never went to war herself, yet her greatest strengths were her mind, her diplomacy, and her ability to survive no matter the circumstances. I hope that through this video, you were able to see Cecily Neville in a new light, and perhaps even dispel some of the myths created by the writers and by Philippa Gregory about her. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like it, and share your thoughts in the comments about the matriarch of the House of York. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.